We've recently revisited a few CPUs of yore. Earlier this year, we published an Intel Decade in Review piece. More recently, we did a revisit of AMD's own decade-old Phenom II 1090T, and then we did the FX-8350 before that. But we skipped over one right in between, and that one is the FX-8150, which was the beginning of the end for AMD in the pre-Ryzen era. This is where AMD really started pumping out core count focused advertising, which later came back to bite it in a class action settlement that it had to pay out over debate over whether these were truly 8-core CPUs or 6 or 4-core, as the case may have been for each CPU's individual advertising approach. So the CPU that we're looking at today, the 8150, launched in October of 2011. It launched alongside the FX-4100 and 6100, and for the higher end, it launched alongside the 8120. But the 8150 was one of the flagships of the Bulldozer and refresh era. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's Conductonaut Liquid Metal. Conductonaut is what we've used in all of our liquid metal and D-lit thermal tests, capable of dropping CPU thermals significantly when replacing the stock thermal interface. Lower CPU thermals don't just allow better overclocks, but also lower noise levels because the transfer efficiency is increased. The mix of gallium and indium makes for a thermal conductivity of 73 watts per meter Kelvin, outclassing traditional pastes significantly. Learn more at the link in the description below. Other CPUs of the time included E-suffix Bulldozer class CPUs, and the E-suffix was just a designation for the power consumption differences. But beyond what we've revisited so far, some notables in the high end would include the FX-9370. This was a CPU that came out in 2013. There was the 9590, also in 2013. And ultimately, AMD, for a long time, really strung along this already kind of weak at launch architecture and tried to get the most it could out of it while it worked eventually on getting towards Ryzen, which would end up mostly saving the company in the CPU space. So today's revisit then, it's not a who aged better piece. We're not looking at old versus old. What we're doing is looking at specifically old AMD versus old AMD, but talking about upgrade pathways if you happen to still be on an 8150. This means we'll be focusing on CPUs like the 8370 as a comparison for the 8150. Part of this at the end will be particularly noteworthy, and that's the power consumption comparison between the two and the efficiency in Blender as an example. We'll also be talking about the Phenom II 1090T, the X6 1090T. That's a CPU we recently revisited. That CPU came out 1 year before the 8150 and was flanked on the other side by Nehalem. So the 1090T and the Phenom era in general, Phenom II that is, had a pretty rough start to life just because it was next to two of Intel's most pivotal architectures, and it was also just before Bulldozer came out, which took a lot of the interest away from the Phenom line. But you see the Phenom naming pick back up with Ryzen, as one of our commenters pointed out last time, almost as if AMD wanted to just sort of hand-wave away the Bulldozer series and forget it ever happened, because the naming scheme after 1090T picks back up with the 1200, for example, in the Ryzen family. So we're looking at the 8150. Again, it's not who aged better, but it's how did AMD and the Bulldozer series age, particularly versus the other CPUs of the era, like the Phenom II, where you had a CPU that could be overclocked pretty high, and at launch, the Phenom II 1090T comparatively sometimes did just as well as the 8150, sometimes better, depending on the application. Now that it's been a decade, though, things have changed a little bit. Even still, we're looking at some upgrade pathways as well, if you happen to still be on one, or just because it's kind of fun. And one thing to keep an eye out for is the 1090T embarrassing the 8150 in at least one test, and that's with 6 cores, and air quotes there, as opposed to 8 cores and air quotes, because they're defined differently for these two generations. So let's get into the numbers. We like to use GTA 5 early in these revisits since it was closer to the time these older CPUs came out. But even GTA 5 was launched late in the life of the 8150. In 2015, when PC players got GTA 5, the FX-8150 was already 4 years old. At 1080p, the FX-8150 starts at 44 FPS average, which has it 10% over the Phenom II X6 1090T from 1 year prior. Frame time consistency was not improved with the 8150 in this set of tests. Of course, 1090T owners of the era might have been disappointed in the 10% hike because it wasn't much to begin with, and a 1090Ti with an overclock already got it to 50 FPS average, about tied with the FX-8150 when overclocked. Now, of course, you'd scale the frame rate number up depending on the settings you use, what game you play, but the scaling and percentage is about the same. The FX-8370's 2014 launch was even more boring, with hardly any improvement after a few years of refreshes. For someone upgrading today, if you're wondering what would be better, the answer is anything would be better at this point. You could buy an R3 1200 or a 1200 AF for under $100 and still see gains. The 3300X makes a lot of sense for gaming on a budget. The 10600K makes sense for a gaming focus with more budget. And the higher core count Ryzen CPUs will prove themselves valuable in later production benchmarks. The Three Kingdoms campaign test is next. In this one, the FX-8150 led the Phenom II 1090Ti by about 12%, with 1% and 0.1% lows not meaningfully different when both are stock. The 1090Ti had some stability issues with our overclock, but did manage to outperform the stock 8150. Again, it's clear why some Phenom owners may have stayed on the platform. Likewise, an 8150 overclock, with some effort put in, has us above the stock 8370 result, which itself is improved over the stock 8150 by 17%. That's a better showing than in the previous game. But for modern upgrades, an R3 3300X is still one of the best value-oriented purchases, while the 3600, behind here from being split across multiple CCXs, would be better leveraged in more workstation applications on a budget. A jump to either of these would offer around 160% uplift stock to stock, while the 10600K would offer comical percentages of improvement if you're going for a pure gaming build with a higher budget. F1 2019 should be an interesting one, given its high FPS caps for CPU testing. In this one, the FX-8150 stock CPU maintained an impressive 29% advantage over the Phenom II 1090Ti. If you were considering upgrading to an 8150 a year after you got your 1090Ti and decided not to because gains weren't big enough, surely now, 10 years later, you're kicking yourself because the 8150 was so much better than the 1090Ti in this game. For the humor impaired, that wasn't really serious. You would have been fine on the 1090Ti for a number of years yet. The 8150 does have a massive gain here though, and we don't see that in many other places when it comes to some of the older games. Even Three Kingdoms, which is a new game, didn't really look quite this severe in terms of the differences. Overclocking gets us another 10 FPS average or so, but lows dip a bit from questionable stability. The FX-8370 is about the same as an overclocked FX-8150 in this title, with an 8370 OC getting it up to modern 4-core, 4-thread Ryzen levels with the 1200. Stock to stock, the 8370 only offered a 13% uplift over the 8150, and that's several years later. Upgrade paths remain the obvious choices. We'll highlight the 3300X, the 3600, and the 10600K as peak considerations depending on budget. Higher core count Ryzen makes more sense once we get to later tests, while the higher expense Intel ones make sense if you're really more interested in a higher FPS. We'll skip the usual 1440p test since we're obviously so CPU bound at this point that it's more of a limiting factor than modern GPUs anyway. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next, another relatively modern title on DX12. The FX-8150 held 60 FPS average here, although its 1% and 0.1% lows began dipping more than the flanking CPUs from the modern era, like the $50 to $60 3000G and the R3 1200. Despite being weak overall, the newer of these three CPUs do offer more consistent frame times. The FX-8370 offered an 11% uplift 3 years later and wouldn't have an upgrade path until 2017's Ryzen 1 launch with the R7 1700, and that would require a new board anyway. That CPU offered a 68% uplift over the 8370, and that wasn't even its final form. As for the 1090Ti, the FX-8150 ran a 26% higher average FPS, so it's not quite as good as the F1 uplift, but still big. It just took most of a decade for the right games to come out to really strain those differences, because with at-launch titles, the 1090Ti held on closer. We'd like to take a moment to highlight the wide, empty void between the FX-8370 OC and the R7 1700. The only emptier void that we've seen is the one in MSI's ethics guidelines. The Division 2 is another brand new title by standards of the FX-8150. The 8150 does surprisingly well for average FPS here, plotting 81 FPS stock and 94 when overclocked, a gain on its own of 16.3%. That said, newer testing standards show us metrics beyond the average. and the 0.1% lows dip exceptionally hard for the FX-8150. We're seeing frame time spikes show up in averaging of the slowest frames, dragging down the 0.1% average to 20 FPS. That's significantly worse than the R3-1200, which is technically worse in averages, but better in frame time consistency. Let's take a look at how that materializes frame by frame. Here's a frame time plot. Lower is better here, but more consistent is best. We ideally don't want to see excursions from the surrounding frames greater than 8 to 12 milliseconds for any given frame. This is the best way to empirically show the actual experience of using the CPU, as it shows you each frame and its required time to render in milliseconds. The FX-8150 quickly hits a 70 millisecond frame time spike, which means you're approaching 1/10 of a second wait time. That's a noticeable stutter in gameplay, and is something you'll notice both visually and mechanically. The 8150 hits another spike later on, up in the 60s. These happened every single run, and worse still, they weren't in the same spots. That means it's inconsistent and not predictable. So this is an issue with the CPU and this title working together at these settings. The R3-1200 notably has much more tightly packed frames, with the amplitude shrunken versus the 8150's peak-to-peak swings. This is where an average FPS becomes less valuable than the 1% or 0.1% low numbers, as the higher average of the 8150 is taken down experientially by the worse consistency. Back to the FPS chart, the 8150 stock CPU led the 1090Ti by 28.9%, about the same as in F1 2019. These newer games really seem to highlight the differences the most. That said, we still wouldn't call the 8150 experience good overall when considering its frame time pacing. The 8370 didn't offer much, holding the same stock baseline as the overclocked 8150 did. The 1090Ti OC also encroached on the stock 8150, for what that's worth. Modern upgrades would include those listed before. The 3300X for cheap gaming with a big uplift, the 3600 for more versatility in other applications, and the 10600K for pure gaming. There's plenty of used options out there too, if you're able to grab an older Ryzen part, or, although it's difficult, an older Intel part for a price that makes sense. Hitman II won't give us any comparative data against the 1090Ti because it was unable to launch the game with DirectX 12, and so the 1090Ti got an F for this test. We still have numbers to share though. The FX-8150 stock CPU ran 51 FPS average, with an overclock offering an uplift of 17.6%. The FX-8370 stock and OC entries flanked our 8150 OC result, although we didn't do any Northbridge tuning when we did our 8370 revisit. We did that by request of the community for the 8150 though. There's another gulf between the 1700 and 8370 in this chart, as seen before. The 1700 improved 71% over the 8150, and the 1700 wasn't even particularly good as a gaming CPU. Don't get us wrong, it was our most recommended of the original R7 lineup, but AMD didn't have the IPCR frequency yet to really gain on same generation Intel. Even still, a 71% uplift is a big paradigm shift from Bulldozer. Red Dead 2 is another game that's too new to run on some CPUs, like the 1090Ti. We were unable to get it working in Vulkan or DX12 on the 1090Ti, but Red Dead ran fine, or as fine as it's able to, given Rockstar's involvement, on the 8150. Stock performance had us at 50 FPS average, with lows dipping hard a few times throughout testing. Overclocking was actually meaningful here and provided a 16% uplift in performance. If you have an old 8150 and want to drag its limping body through another year of use, overclocking is probably a good time investment. Just be careful of the VRM quality. The 8370 stock performance ends up somewhat embarrassing in this title, offering only a couple FPS improvement over the 8150 stock. The OC didn't do as well since we didn't push the Northbridge, but overall, that's where it lands. Modern upgrade options are, as we stated earlier, and the gulf again between the 1700 and the old CPUs is wide. We've left the 4690K on this chart, so that's sort of the king of the olds for this limited selection, and you can still see a big gap. We'll move into a limited sweep of our production benchmarks now. This is where the higher core count modern CPUs, like the 3700X and up, start to differentiate themselves more in these tests than they did in gaming benchmarks. We'll start with the tile-based cycles renderer that we use in Blender. Starting with the GN Monkey Head stress test, the 8150 required 64 minutes to render when stock, compared to 53 minutes on the 8370. That's an 18% time reduction in the refresh, similar to the gains seen from overclocking the 8150 and its Northbridge. Performance of the 1090Ti with an overclock ends up a bit ahead of the stock 8150 here, while its advertising suggested that it had 2 fewer cores than the 8150. Again, illustrating some of the early disappointment in Bulldozer. Anything at all would be an upgrade here. Even the 3300X cuts times in half, and we don't even recommend it for users who are commonly doing this type of workload. The 3600 would be the best value, for balance anyway, if working in tile-based renderers like this regularly. Even if you're doing stuff with CUDA and you're thumbing your nose up at the CPU aspect, it's still useful. You can split render the CPU and the GPU to reduce time further if you tune the tile sizes a bit. For the GN logo render, the 8150 required an impressively slow 88 minutes to complete the render, actually making it worse than the 2-core 4-thread Athlon 3000G at 4 GHz. Overclocking the 8150 helped to drag it to a 70-minute completion time, which is about where this stock 8370 finished. The 1090T OC was right around the stock 8150 again, while the stock result is at the floor of this chart. Adobe Premiere video rendering is next, coupled with CUDA and representing a realistic rendering scenario that we use for our own videos. Our 1080p render is a convention center RNG shoot, which the 8150 finished in 13 minutes. Remember, it's not about the absolute time required. That's variable based on the project. It's about percent scaling. And also, if you're doing stuff once, sure, waiting extra, like 13 minutes, isn't so bad. If you're doing it a lot, or you're working with more complex projects than a couple-minute RNG shoot, it starts to matter, and we'll look at those scenarios in a second. The overclocked 8150 dropped down to 10 minutes, a 20% time reduction. The 8370 is again about where the overclocked 8150 is, and the overclocked 8370 didn't offer much additional performance. As for the 1090T, its one entry is adjacent to the 8150. For our 4K B-roll render, project times balloon and post the 8150 stock at 42 minutes, with its overclock dropping 18% to 34 minutes. For reference, even the 3100 offers a 50% time reduction against the 8150 stock result. The 1090T didn't finish this test and would need some stability tuning to get it through, but frankly, it wasn't really worth it. Chromium code compile is next, represented in a Windows environment. The 8370 actually offers a massive uplift over the 8150 here, at least in terms of raw minutes, and claims a 13% time reduction. An extra hour reduction in compile time in this benchmark is noticeable in a practical sense. And overclocking the 8150 pushed it to 281 minutes. Another impressive reduction against stock, but still not good performance. The 1090T was around the same place when overclocked and thoroughly embarrasses the 8150's result. Power testing is sort of fun to look at for these old CPUs. We're measuring at the EPS 12-volt cables, so this is done before VRM efficiency losses are accounted for. All same socket CPUs are measured on the same boards though, so that helps to negate that effect. The FX-8150 required 126 watts for that blender test we showed earlier, so if nothing else, the 8370 did actually provide an efficiency uplift. It was still power hungry when compared to other parts, but that was one of the shining spots on the refresh refinements. Overclocking the 8150 required obscene levels of power at 260 watts, which is more than a 64-core 3990X. So that's it for the 8150. It's interesting to see the new data, but things haven't changed too much for the CPU. Bulldozer was never particularly powerful as a gaming architecture especially. It did poorly versus i5s and i7s for many years, and as Intel continued to launch things, it continued to establish an increasing lead, where AMD was stuck in the pattern that Intel has been stuck in lately of doing refresh after refresh. Now that said, Intel right now is still pushing increasingly more frequency, just like AMD was trying to do with the FX line, except Intel's got a little bit more room to play with just because of the power efficiency improvements over the last decade. But that runway is running out rapidly, and Intel needs to get into gear and launch something other than 14 nanometer sometime soon. Otherwise, it will actually end up stuck in a cycle like AMD was with Bulldozer, Piledriver, and to some extent, although minor, Excavator later on. So 8150, if you had wondered, didn't age particularly well, but it's an interesting look at how the Phenom II 1090T compares to the 8150. They were 1 year apart in age, and at launch, the 1090T, if you remember those reviews, was pretty close to the 8150, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, but the gaps over time have gotten wider in some of these, especially gaming scenarios, where the 8150 is now able to establish a bit more of a delta, but still not a great CPU. There's plenty of good upgrade options out there. If you're on one, it may be worth considering an overclock to try and stretch it out another year or so if you have a VRM capable of handling an overclock, but That'll be it for this one. Thanks for watching the revisit. Check back for more. As always, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to support us directly, like by grabbing one of our wireframe mouse mats. They are in stock on the store and shipping now. If you back ordered previously, it'll be going out in the next couple of days. If not, it should probably be out already by the time this goes up. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.